Well, good morning to those of you joining us from the United States or North America. Good afternoon to everyone in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and a welcome to all of you who have joined us today. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and AICGS is really pleased to host this virtual seminar. And the title is Regional Inequality and Populist Voting in Germany and the United States. I'm going to hand the floor over in just a moment to my colleague, Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is Senior Fellow and Director of our program on society, culture, and politics. And we are really pleased today to hear from Michael Bayerlein, who is a DAAD AICGS visiting fellow this fall. And this is a virtual fellowship this year because of all of the usual and well-known circumstances. And this is our second virtual presentation of the work of one of our visiting virtual fellows. So we are really pleased to be embarking on this new way of carrying out this important relationship we have with the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. And I will now get out of the way and let Eric and Michael Bayerlein take us through what promises to be an extremely exciting, interesting, and very timely topic. Eric, you've got the helm.
Thanks, Jeff. And welcome, everybody. I've had many opportunities actually to discuss this project with Michael, and I've also had a chance to kind of read a draft of his paper. And I have to say, I'm very, very excited about these findings that he's going to present with us today. So without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours. I should tell everybody that once he's finished presenting, we'll have a moderated question and answer period where I will read the questions to Michael. So please put those in the Q&A, and then I will curate them and perhaps sometimes combine questions. So that's how we will proceed after the formal presentation. So Michael, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this introduction and for hosting me as a fellow this year, over the course of which I conducted this project, which I termed Regional Inequality and Populist Voting in Germany and US. And I'm very glad that so many people joined in for my talk about the project. And before going into detail, I want to first sketch out the motivation for this project, which was not only the now recent tight electoral defeat of Donald Trump, but also his electoral victory in 2016 and the continued support for the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland populist party in Germany. And there's a vivid debate going on both sides of the Atlantic on what determines this support for populist politicians and parties or populist actors. And in defining populism, just as a brief note, I follow Kassmutter and define populism as a rhetoric, a political style in which the populist actor divides society in the people and the corrupt elite. So it's less an ideology and more a rhetoric or a political style. And the AfD and Mr. Trump are united in this style of talking about politics. And the determinants, which I just want to sketch out really briefly to give you an overview, that are discussed as determinants of populism or that can explain populist voting, range from the economic situation of the individual over cultural changes up to growing inequality. And if you look at these publications and the discussions, these determinants are often linked in one way or the other to globalization. So globalization-induced changes in economic situations due to import competition or import shocks, cultural changes through migration, or globalization-induced inequality. And it's especially this last part, globalization-induced inequality, that I want to focus on in this presentation. And when we look at both countries, we see strong subnational variation in populist support, with certain counties in Germany and the US, or certain areas, seeing very high vote shares for the AfD and Mr. Trump respectively, while others see very low vote shares. And if we want to stick to this narrative of globalization leads to inequality and thereby to populist voting, we surprisingly find that when we look at these areas where populist vote share is high, we see that these are the areas that are less globalized and that are rather equal. So if we want to hold up that narrative that globalization somehow correlates via inequality with populist voting, this direct link of where globalization is, there is also inequality and thus populist voting, has to be rather indirect. So there has to be something else going on there that links these components to one another than the mere direct impact of globalization. And this is somehow the path that I want to go down on today in the remainder of this presentation. So first of all, the rather simple research question that I want to answer with you in this webinar is, how can regional variance in populist support in Germany and the US be explained? And I want to summarize my argument already at the beginning, so you already know where I'm heading with this. And I want to shift away from the absolute inequality and being affected by globalization towards regional, or as I term it in this project, spatial inequality. And my argument is that spatial inequality increases as certain counties in Germany and the US benefit more than others from ongoing or increasing globalization. So there are some countries that are heavily affected by globalization and that are prospering due to globalization, while others are left behind. And this growing spatial inequality polarizes society and makes voters susceptible to a populist, the people versus the elite, the forgotten poor people, hardworking against the corrupt elite in the wealthy regions of the country. And the third argument that I will make is that public good provision can mediate this inequality and ultimately can also cushion the link or the blow from spatial inequality on populist voting, meaning that populist voting can be or is lower in counties where public good provision is high, even though spatial inequality is also high. But I will go into detail about this in the next couple of minutes. First of all, let's take a step back and look at the connection between globalization and spatial inequality. We know from other research contributions that there are conflicting findings regarding the effect of globalization on poverty and also on populist voting, which is often due to the fact not that these publications really have different results, but that they use different definitions or conceptualizations, or actually look at different things. And this becomes clear when we look more closely at the connection between globalization and inequality, in that globalization reduces inequality between nations by making some countries richer and thus equaling it out, while the inequality increases within nations that are globalizing. And to make this point even clearer, we see a decline or a reduction in the middle class income share in almost all Western democracies. So as globalization progresses and those countries get richer, inequality within these countries gets larger. And this decline in income share is not equally distributed within countries. So there are certain regions where this is larger and others where it is not. Meaning that some counties, just like I said, are reaping or seemingly reap the benefits of globalization, while others are left behind. And the question becomes, how can we capture this sort of inequality? Because if we just look at regions that are left behind in terms of there's not much import to GDP ratio going on there, or there's not much workforce from abroad, then we might look at something like the Gini coefficient and find that the Gini coefficient measuring inequality in those regions is relatively low, which is the case because those are rather poor regions. And if everybody's poor, I'm oversimplifying here, but if everybody's poor, then of course inequality is low. So we have to capture this effect of that there's a regional component to inequality. And this is what I want to measure with this concept of spatial inequality within countries. And spatial inequality is nothing else than the percentage deviation of the median household income in a county from the national median income average. So just the county income divided by the national median income, multiplied by 100 to give a percentage point, and multiplied by -1, so that high scores, high percentage scores, indicate high spatial inequality. Just for sake of the correctness of what I'm doing here, I also explained the equation on the slide. It's not necessary to read that. It's just important to have in mind that the score gives the percentage point difference with high values indicating high spatial inequality. And just to get a broad idea of what is going on there, I don't want to go too much into detail because it's like a quantitative project at this point in time. So I want to give you broad strokes on what I'm doing. But I want to show you what the data looks like in Germany and the US. So in Germany, we see a spatial inequality score from -74% to about plus 27%. And this 27% indicates that there are some counties that are apart from the median income by 27% percentage points, meaning they are above what is actually the median income or apart from that. So those are countries that score high on spatial inequality, meaning that they are relatively poor. While in the United States, this range is much higher. It scores from -172% to 56%. So again, this range, like I said, is much wider in the United States, already indicating that the polarization that I talked about might be much larger in the United States. I will not go back into detail about that because it would go too far. But again, we see that the median income in the county with the highest spatial inequality deviates by 56% in the United States from the median income. So the gap is much wider than in Germany. And I also mapped out the distribution of spatial inequality, indicating in red the counties with especially high spatial inequality, so a high deviation from the median income. And in the less red or the light colored counties, those are the counties that deviate in the negative direction. So they are the rich counties, relatively speaking. And we see some regional clusters. In Germany, it's very pronounced with Eastern Germany, but also the Ruhr area in Western Germany. And in the United States, we also see similar patterns of counties that we already, or states, or even that we would also, from our gut feeling, identify as the counties where, or the states where median incomes are usually lower than, for example, at the West Coast or the East Coast. So just to show you that there is some variation going on, and it is somehow, in my opinion, meaningful by showing that there are also regional clusters in this spatial inequality. But how does this spatial inequality relate to populist voting? I argued that this spatial inequality leads to societal polarization between rich counties and counties left behind. And this polarization creates a favorable condition for this populist, anti-elite, people-centrist rhetoric. So it finds like a fruitful ground in this polarized settings of economic grievances. But, and this is the important point, the rhetoric itself, this anti-elite rhetoric by itself, is rather fleshless, I would say, or follow other contributions that also argue that. That means that it has to be filled out somehow, and populists do so by providing an additional narrative along which society is mobilized, or along which voters are mobilized. And these narratives define who the elite in this scenario actually is, and who the people are, and what the threat to those people, is. So, for example, the elite can be an economic elite, meaning international financial institutions, or the European Union, or whatever. And the important thing here is that even when a shock is economic in its nature, like in my case, the spatial inequality, the political manifestation can be different depending on the narrative that is employed by the populist actor. And the specific form of this narrative depends on the salience of pre-existing cleavages in society. What does that mean? We usually differentiate between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And the argument goes that left-wing populists exploit the economic societal cleavage, so an economic conflict, usually labor versus capital, while right-wing populism exploits a cultural cleavage, so a struggle of an in-group versus an out-group, and this out-group is somehow in cahoots with the elite, and the people are not represented anymore by the elite, and also their cultural hegemony is undermined by this outgroup, and also their economic well-being. So this is a rather simple division that I show you here. Of course, in reality, it's more complex. It can be overlapping. But the point why I'm telling you this is that only because people vote for the AfD or for Donald Trump, and, for example, do this based on the positions they take against outgroups, that does not mean that the underlying shock for voting those parties or actors might not be economic. Saying that the salience of this cultural conflict makes it more likely that an economic shock is used to mobilize people along a cultural cleavage. And this is what's happening, or what some authors argue, and what I would strongly support in Germany and the US, because the cultural in-group versus out-group conflict that is usually at the heart of right-wing populist narratives is stronger in Germany and the US than a left-wing populist discourse, which then lends itself to the right-wing populist narratives of the people from the out-group want to take away X or whatever. So to sum this up, and I love to go into more detail about this mechanism in the discussion. I'm trying to show you this in like rather broad strokes. We can talk about this for hours, I guess. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the spatial inequality and the economic grievance that it is paves the way for the activation of pre-existing cultural nativist group conflicts that can be exploited by populist actors. Of course, this is not to say that there might not also be a direct link from spatial inequality, people that feel left behind and that somehow find, for example, the AfD as a party that somehow gives them the feeling that when he votes for them, then everything will be well again. But it kind of explains the part that economic shocks can translate into voting for a party that actually has not that much on its agenda to do for counties that are left behind. So that's not like the major issue that the AFD is pushing. So how can this link be made? And this is the explanation how these economic grievances can translate into a cultural conflict, or voting along a cultural conflict line of in-group versus out-group. This leads me to show you just like very briefly, again, a map of Germany and the United States with darker blue areas indicating a higher vote share for the AFD or Mr. Trump, respectively. And those are the areas that we also like have in mind as populist counties or even states in Germany and the United States. So there's considerable regional variance, just like I said in the introduction. And what I'm trying to explain here is how this, what I'm trying to explain is exactly this regional variance in populist voting. And I offer the argument that spatial inequality is a crucial determinant in explaining this variance. This leads me to my hypothesis that the higher the spatial inequality score of a county, the higher the populist vote share in that county will be. And I don't want to bore you with a lot of like operationalization and data. Maybe some of our viewers are interested in quantitative methods, so it's just here for the sake of that. I want to go over that rather briefly, that I will look at the counties in elections in Germany and the United States, respectively 2017, the German Bundestag election, and the US presidential election in 2016. And the explanatory variable, so that the variable that I use to explain populist vote share is, like I said, spatial inequality that measures the county percentage deviation from the national median household income. And the explained variables, or what I want to explain, is the populist vote share for Mr. Trump and the AFD, respectively, or I should be more precise, the right-wing populist vote share. I run an OLS regression model. I will not bore you with that, and come straight to my results. Those are the predicted populist vote shares depending on the degree of spatial inequality. And what we see here is that there's a positive correlation, meaning the higher the spatial inequality, the higher the predicted populist vote share. So as spatial inequality increases in a county, so does the populist vote share. This dashed horizontal line is the average populist vote share, or in this case, the vote share the AFD had in the parliamentary election of 2017. So we see that in the high numbers of spatial inequality, or in the countries with high spatial inequality, the AFD has had a vote share above the average. And a similar picture emerges in the United States. Here again, there's a positive correlation between spatial inequality and populist voting, with counties that see high spatial inequality also witnessing or displaying above average vote share in the election for Donald Trump. And the question now becomes, and this is the last point I want to make, how can we somehow cushion the blow? Meaning, how can we mitigate spatial inequality, let alone that political consequences that might arise from rising spatial inequality might be something that we want to avoid. Just looking at spatial inequality, this is something that should be dealt with, because we will not be able to, or will hardly be able to, make some regions globalized or more globalized over a short period of time. Those are long structural processes that draw investors or corporations or whatever to certain regions. So there must be more or less that's my idea, is something that we can do in the short term or medium term at least. And this is what brings me to the provision of public goods and the research that is concerned with this provision of public goods. Because we know from previous research that rural areas display especially high populist vote shares if the provision of public goods is low or inadequate. And the mechanism that is at work here, or that is proposed by authors that argue along this line, closely resembles what my argument is, being that those counties are left behind, or the feeling of being left behind emerges, which provides further ground for the populist rhetoric, which then can be embedded in a broader narrative of struggle of the people against an outgroup or the elite, depending on the specific context. So I argued that both factors, spatial inequality and public goods provision, correlate with populist voting, and due to the similarity of the mechanism, should reinforce each other, or should, to one degree or another, be interrelated. And from this, I formulate the expectation that populist voting is especially high in counties with low provision of public goods and high spatial inequality. And this is the interesting part, that spatial inequality can be compensated by adequate provision of public goods. And I want to also dive into this empirically for a second, and I created a measurement to capture the provision of public goods. It's an additive index from 0 to 10 that captures medical infrastructure, education facility, the public transportation, broadband internet, so public goods that have been shown to be correlated with populist voting. And this very nice shiny graph shows you the predicted populist vote share in the United States, depending on the degree of spatial inequality and public good provision. And we see here in the light blue area or dark blue areas, low predicted populist vote share, or relatively low predicted populist vote share, and in the darker red areas, a high predicted populist vote share. And we see in the lower right corner the scenario where spatial inequality is high and the provision of public goods is low, which is, according to this simple analysis, connected to each other in that populist vote shares are especially high in this scenario. While when we look at the upper right corner, which is, in my opinion, the most interesting one, we see that in a scenario where spatial inequality is high, the predicted populist vote share is nonetheless low if the provision of public goods is high. So even though spatial inequality is high, public goods provision leads to the result that populist vote share is relatively low, while it's not vice versa. So even if spatial inequality is low, if public goods provision is also low, we still see a considerable amount of predicted populist votes in this lower left corner. But the upper right corner is the most important one, because it's a spatial inequality high scenario. And to look at this in Germany, the graphs look similar. It's a little bit different in two regards. We also see a high populist vote share in a spatial inequality high, public goods provision low scenario. But similar to the United States, we also see that if spatial inequality is high, but the provision of public goods is also high, that the vote share is relatively low. The only thing that is different is that if spatial inequality is low, it doesn't matter how high the provision of public goods are in terms of predicted populist vote share. So this area is different from the calculation from the United States, but the one that we are most interested in is this upper right area, which is consistent in both scenarios. This leads me to the, I call it takeaway policy advice in terms of what can we do about spatial inequality, or what can we do in this scenario. And my argument was that economic grievances paved the way for the populist rhetoric in order to mobilize people to vote for populist actors. And this is by the activation of pre-existing group conflict narratives. And like I told you, public goods can mitigate these economic grievances. However, and this is a very important point, if we assume that this mechanism is true, then the economic grievances that exist only activate the pre-existing conflict potential that can then be exploited by populist actors. So the susceptibility to this out-group cultural conflict narrative is not resolved by this. It is merely a pill against it. So public goods alleviate the symptoms, but not the cause, the existence of these group conflict narratives that have to be resolved with different means than just provision of public goods. Looking at the time, I want to finish up, or to wrap up, to get into discussion with you about my work. Just want to summarize real quick that my research question was that how the regional variance in populist support in the United States and Germany can be explained. And my argument was that spatial inequality is a crucial component in explaining the support. And I also connected spatial inequality to the provision of public goods and showed that public goods can mitigate the effect of spatial inequality on populist voting, so that populist voting is less affected by spatial inequality if the provision of public goods in a certain county is adequate. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you very much already.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. That was really quite thought-provoking. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to just jump right in. I might take them out of order, but let's start with some questions from Dan Huff in Britain. There's several components to the question here, but it really seems to have to do with Die Linke, right? The left party, which also can be seen through a populist prism. So I guess one question would be, how does voting for the left party affect your thesis? And yeah, so some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I would argue that Die Linke is, in part, if not absolutely, a left-wing populist party that, to come back to this narrative explanation, that mobilizes along an economic cleavage, or mostly, it's never one or the other, it's not exclusive. And I would say that the mechanism in general is also applicable to the Linke, but I would say that the AfD has been more successful in exploiting this social polarization and framing the cultural, the societal conflict in cultural terms than the Linke has been in recent years. So I would definitely say that the Linke is an interesting case to look at, and I will also look at the Linke, but the comparison did not work for the United States, because on the state level, on the actual presidential election, there was no left-wing populist to compare it to, but it's a very valid point.
All right, next, here's a question from Myra Marks-Faree. So lots of political geographers in the United States point to the population sorting itself into red and blue places over time. And this seems to be pretty similar to Germany with the outmigration from Eastern Germany towards the West. So if population movement is part of the process, isn't it more directly connected to the right populist view of the native population being replaced in its demographic winter, as the phrase goes?
Yeah. So thank you first of all for that idea or that interesting thought. I would definitely agree that this moving of people, especially young, good educated people, to the urban centers has a significant impact on populist voting or the abandonment of the rural areas in the United States and also in Germany. So there's definitely a self-sorting component to it. What I found very interesting, nonetheless, is that this replacement is not really happening in that, for example, in Germany, if you look at Eastern Germany, the population to migration rate is super low. So it's true that people leave those places and those places become even more forgotten, if you want to put it like that. But it's not that then other people move to those places and this whole change of like people in there is happening. But like I said, the moving of people is definitely an important component in that.
All right, and next, here's a question from Astrid Schmidt-King. Does your research take into account spatial inequalities' relationship with race? In the US, the pre-existing cultural and economic cleavages do relate to socioeconomic status, which arguably is closely related to race.
Yeah, I have to be plain about that. No, it does not. And this is definitely a problem up to this point, because it's also different to, or it relates to a more broader problem that is the comparison of Germany to the United States in general. I don't want to say that this is not possible, but we have different mechanisms in place there. Societal dynamics are different, and pre-existing conflicts or economic grievances are different. So I would say that for the US context, this is a very important component that is not in there yet. And I'm still trying to like figure out how this could also be a case in Germany, which definitely is, but maybe a different one. And to connect those two strands, because there's definitely some sort of like path dependency in there. So less of an answer than, or less of a great insight, but just acknowledging that this is definitely a thing to consider.
Okay, so we're getting several questions about policy implications. And I have to say that one of the most interesting things that I think has come out of your research is the way that public goods provision can cushion the blow, as you put it. But a question from Jonas Triga: what is the projected future of spatial inequality and public goods provision in Germany and the United States? Do you think that the United States will be even more prone to populist electoral victories in the future, given the challenges in this country with public goods provision?
Yeah, so as being a political scientist, as I guess a lot of you are also, I will not comment on what will happen in the future because that notoriously backfires. But I can imagine that if public goods provision goes down even further and the wealth redistribution, which basically it's nothing else than that, and not really like payments to individual persons, but regional wealth redistribution in public goods increases, then the research as of now shows that populist voting will increase. So a really cautious prediction there, but why would it be different in the future if those trends are already there? Yeah.
All right, and then kind of related to that, you did mention in your presentation that you can cushion the blow, you can mitigate the impact of spatial inequality through public goods provision, but that's not, addressing the root cause. So do you have any thoughts on how the root causes of spatial inequality giving rise to populist voting might be tackled?
Yeah, so I try to point out that this is maybe a problem that is in a totally different area, meaning that these conflict narratives of people being threatened by changes in their environment, by the erosion of traditional values, and being prone to authoritarian ideas, even though they like cover them as being democratic. This is something that is not explained or cannot be explained or addressed by like providing money or services to people. It's a rather socio-psychological issue that has to be addressed in this realm. And I don't want to go into this whole, okay, people have to be educated more and whatever. This is certainly not the case, or not so simple. But I would say that the root cause has to be addressed, especially in those areas, making people sure of themselves. I will put it very like abstract, and taking away fear of loss of social status, of being in a societal group that is exchanged with another group. So this has to be addressed in a different way than just public goods provision. I hope that answers the question.
So a question from Tom Lancaster, and this has to do with the left versus right forms of populism, the economic and the cultural aspects. Why is it that in Germany and the United States, it seems that the cultural, so the right-wing populist response is stronger than the left? And how does this relate back to spatial inequality?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to go down the answer to answer this. I want to go down the argument of Danny Roderick, who argues that there are different structures in place in countries that lend themselves to be exploited either in an economic cleavage conflict way or in a cultural way. And one aspect is a large stock of migrant population, meaning that if this is a salient issue in the respective context, that migration is high and people from different countries come there, then it's way easier to exploit as a dimension of conflict than in a country where there's not much migration going on. I make the simple comparison to say, in Russia, you probably have some problems in arguing that, for example, people from South America take your job. You know what, it's of course a simplified argument, but there has to be something there to make this narrative of a conflict. And in Germany and in the US, the structure, the state structure or the societal structure lends itself to this conflict and not to this classical labor versus capital conflict, which is a prolonged conflict in South America and in southern parts of Europe, in Spain or in Greece, where also the import to export structures, let alone, lend themselves to prolonged societal debates about the labor-intensive work versus the capitalists, which is like the tradition there, but not in Germany in that sense.
All right, now a question from Jeff Anderson. Is there an empirical reason to differentiate between spatial inequality as manifested in rural areas and spatial inequality as manifested in the declining, transitioning industrial areas? So the kind of Rust Belt areas. So is one of these types of counties more vulnerable to populist mobilization than the other?
I cannot say anything about that based on what I did, because I have to be honest, I did not look at this difference yet, because there's no time component in my research up to now. This will be the next step. So it's just like a snapshot of 2017 and 2016 respectively, United States and Germany. But my hunch is that this decline of formerly industrialized areas or counties that are now in decline is the effect there is more pronounced than in rural areas that have been rural for a long time, just from a socio-psychological phenomenon of if you lose something, then you're more angry than if you never had it. So from that perspective, I would argue that this declining counties are more prone to populist voting, but I cannot back this with empirical evidence yet.
My gut would tell me that you're probably onto something there. And maybe you saw the excellent piece in the New York Times, I think yesterday, by Thomas Edsel on status anxiety and how that seems to be one of the main drivers of what's going on here. Okay, the next question is from Eugene Sekhelov. How do you reconcile the paradox of the mitigation of public good and the deep-seated sentiment of libertarianism?
Yeah, so this is something that I discussed with a lot of the people at the AICGS, because it is, especially for the US, something that seems to be counterintuitive. And my argument would be that this public good provision is something else than just the mere wealth redistribution, which is then immediately coined as like a socialist propaganda or program in the United States. So it is more like a state as a provider in that sense, as a provider for me to live out my life freely and independent. So meaning that if you live in a county, or of course not like a regional a super expert about the United States, but I would argue that, for example, if you live in a county and you have to drive to the next doctor for 45 to 60 minutes, that's not something that a libertarian would say, oh, this is great, I'm my own person and I can drive to the doctor as far as I want. So I guess that would still work for somebody that says the state should leave me alone. Of course they should, in his mind, but the state should still provide me internally with everything I need to live my life freely and without restriction.
All right, here's a great question from Jonas Triga again. Do your results reliably rule out overdetermination due to cultural heritage? Because it seems that populism is clustered in the US Deep South, former Confederacy, and in Eastern Germany, former German Democratic Republic. So could right-wing populism merely be the consequence of this historical cultural legacy? And then do your results indicate that nonetheless spatial inequality and public good provisions have independent effects?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This is an excellent question. And we know from several research contributions that there's a strong correlation between populist voting and voting for the Nazi party in Germany, for example. And also just a recent paper that I read that has been published in the American Political Science Review about the correlation between Nazi concentration camps and AfD voting today. So that there's some sort of like a cultural heritage, to put it that, in certain regions, not that the people that live there contributed to atrocities, but that they are somehow in regions where this has been an issue and where the support for certain things like the NSDAP was high. I would nonetheless argue that this even might just relate to my work in that those seem to be regions where those conflict narratives or those ideas of the people versus the elite, we have to get rid of them up there for the poor people down here, are more relatable in areas where, due to cultural path dependency, those ideas and resentments are still present and can be activated by economic shocks. So that's to go back to one of the first questions. Those are issues that cannot be mitigated by the provision of public goods. If we have like prolonged for 50 or even 200 years of thinking that goes in this direction that is somehow, a cultural heritage that has to be tackled on another dimension than just throwing money at it, if you want to put it simple.
All right, and a question from Jonathan Olsen, who wonders whether spatial inequality can be so easily transmitted into voting for a particular party or individual, since we know that not every voter who shares a particular set of attitudes or perceptions of conditions will translate that vote the same way. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I want to draw on the argument that is made specifically in the public good provision literature, where a similar argument has been made or is often discussed, in that being that the counties that had low public goods provision prior to the existence of the AFD had high numbers of non-voters. And after the AFD gained track, and also after it switched from I don't want to say left-wing populism, but they had like a stronger focus on this economic cleavage. The euro is ruining Europe, financial transaction, whatever. After they took a turn to the right, those counties and the non-voters in those counties turned out to vote the AFD. So the counties affected by a low provision of public goods. And I would say that the same mechanism is also in place here. So that spatial inequality spatial inequality leads people to, if anything, abstain from voting, but also they might now, and this is the argument, vote for the AFD, because now there's a party that addresses their grievances in a proper way. And of course, you're totally right. There's no like linear translation. That's why I also spent so much time in explaining how economic shocks can nonetheless activate like cultural conflicts in that sense. But that's just I have to say, an assumption that we have to make in these like quantitative approaches, because if we say that people have certain motivations, but their voting behavior might be totally different from what they actually should vote for or what they actually think they should vote for, then it kind of falls apart. So this is some like random noise that we have to kind of accept here and hope that it's like randomly distributed and that the most of the people vote for the parties that they want to vote for, or that they at least think they should want to vote for.
All right, well, seeing as we have so many political scientists participating, let me pose a couple of more technical questions. One of them is from me, and I forgot to write this to you when I was giving you comments the other day, but have you corrected your spatial inequality index for cost of living, right? Because, I mean, it's one thing to have a median income that diverges quite a bit below the national average, but if the cost of living is, half in, rural South Dakota compared to, I don't know, Dallas, Texas, I mean, so I'm just wondering about that. And then a question back from Myra, because I noticed this as well. When you had the graph of US results, where even the lowest spatial inequality counties had a populist vote share of over 60%, when of course Trump didn't win the popular vote either in 2016 or 2020.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start in reverse order on that point. That is basically due to the fact that there are several, it's more technical answer. I'm sorry for the rest too. So that is due to the fact that there are counties that have so low spatial inequality that the graph goes on pretty long. And I just like cut it off at a certain point for reasons of displaying. But it's great that you caught that. So the actual graph goes way more down to until minus 170, and then it drops significantly at that point. So that's why it's still that high at that area. And the cost of living part, that's very interesting, because it is not yet in the model. It's super important to have it in there. the findings, they have to be all taken with a grain of salt, because the robustness checks and calculating again and again with different measurements is still out there or still going on. So I will definitely include that. I would nonetheless argue that costs of living are an important component, but in an ever more globalizing world, they have to a certain extent reduced importance in some sort. Because of course, if you live in, I don't know, in Saxony, at the border to neighboring countries, probably your cost of living are low. The housing is low, and you earn less, but you also have to spend less on like daily costs of living. But that only covers like food and your housing and maybe electricity and stuff. If you want to buy something on Amazon, doesn't matter where you are located. Costs the same whether you're like in a high income county of Starnberg or whether you're a super low income country. The TV is always $800 or whatever, just making an example here. And I would say that it's the same in the United States. So definitely a factor, but maybe a factor that is of declining importance. Maybe, just to guess.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So here's a great one from Suzana Deepa, which has to do with gender differences in the context of spatial inequality and public goods distribution and populist voting behavior. Do women and men vote differently or similarly? And what would a difference mean for your argument?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we know that there are gender differences in populist voting in the United States as well as in Germany. I looked at that in Germany, particularly with women being less prone to vote for the AfD than men. I have to think about the implications for spatial inequality in general. I would argue that if you want to make this like binary thing of women versus men in that sense, that maybe women are less subjective to these cultural conflict narratives than men. And thereby more susceptible to the populist rhetoric, because women and men are probably affected about the same by spatial inequality. Of course, like stereotypical households where like there are gender roles that have not been overcome yet, with women staying home, they are indirectly affected by this, because the men, if they are like in these stereotypical gender roles, men are earning also less there. So it's definitely a very important point. But I would say that the mechanism kind of works the same, and the gender role comes in at this point of who's susceptible to this populist rhetoric and narratives.
All right, well, we're coming up on the hour. So we'll have to conclude this webinar. I wanted to let everybody know that we've been recording this, and so that will be posted on the AICGS website. Michael is also working on a paper that will be distributed through our regular channels soon-ish as well. So you'll have lots of other opportunities to re-engage with this very interesting research. So Michael, thank you very much. It's been great having you as a DAAD AICGS fellow. I hope that we stay in touch. And for the other people, the other participants listening in, we're gonna have one more of these webinars for our third fellow coming up. And then of course, we're gonna have lots of events in the new year. So keep looking out for the advisor and checking out our website and us on social media. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Michael. Happy holidays to all.